The Jerry Powell podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, preparing society and meeting the needs of an aging population. And now, here are your hosts.
Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast. This is Eric Quidera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, we have a special guest today on the line.
We have an extra special guest on the line today. We have Mary Tinetti, who's a geriatrician at Yale, famous researcher, mentor to legions, a mover and shaker in the field. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary. Welcome to Jerry Powell Podcast.
Couldn't be happier. Only thing that's sad, I wasn't the 100th broadcast, but I'll.
You can come back for that one.
All right.
So we're going to be talking about your recent publication in JEM Internal Medicine. The title was Association of Patient Priorities, Aligned Decision-Making with Patient Outcomes and Ambulatory Healthcare Burden Among Older Adults with Multiple Chronic Conditions. That's a long title, but we're going to break that one down. But before we do, we always ask the guests, do you have a song request for Alex?
I do, and I'm so happy that Alex knows it. My very favorite artist is Joni Mitchell, and he's going to do for us Ladies of the Canyon.
Ladies of the Canyon in a very deep voice. Here we go. Trina wears her wampum beads. She fills her drawing book with lines. Sewing lace on windows weeds and filigrees on leaf and vine. Vine and leaf are filigree, and her coat's a second-hand one. Trimmed in antique luxury, she is a lady of the canyon.
Very nice.
That was great. Brought me right back to my youth. I love it.
Mary, can I ask why you chose that song?
Well, I think she's just the best singer-songwriter. I'm an old folkie, and she, I think, is really the spirit of that age. And I like that one because I wanted to have that's probably one of her higher octave ones, and I wanted to hear Alex do it, and he did it well.
I did it more like Eddie Vedder meets Joni Mitchell.
I heard the Eddie Vedder there. So we're going to be talking about your JAM Internal Medicine article, and I'm wondering if you've had such an amazing career, ranging from a lot of different topics, really well known for things like falls and balance and a gait assessment. How did you get interested in this particular subject about identifying and asking about patient priorities?
Yeah, thanks for the great question. So my first, as you said, my early work was on falls and balance, and I absolutely loved it. And I sort of felt I'd kind of taken that topic as far as it could be taken. It was time for other people who had other skill sets to get it more broadly disseminated into practice. And so I was ready to move on to something else probably about 10 years ago now. And, just like my work with falls that came out of my seeing patients every single day, you as a geriatrician know as well as I do, you look at somebody's electronic health record and you see a problem list of 10, 15, 20. You see a medication list of that, and just what are we doing here? I just kept saying is, just like everybody who takes care of these older adults, what are we going to do about this? Everybody recognized the problem, and I just sort of felt let's try to tackle it and see what happens.
Terrific. And how did you come to formulate, or how did you and your team come to formulate this notion of patient priorities care, and what is it?
Yeah, so that's another good question. So in terms of how we got there is I was learning from other people who were doing research at that time and kind of trying to take it away from the very constrained randomized trial where the quotes expert investigators and clinicians decide what to test and how to test it. With this new world of implementation science that was happening in the real world, one of the things that you hear over and over again, you have to get all the stakeholders. And it's a term I hate. I hate the word stakeholder, but I can't come up with a better term. So if you got a better one, guys, I'd love to hear it. But we needed to hear what was important to patients, to their caregivers, to the primary clinicians, to the specialty clinicians, payers, everybody who were either taking care of people with chronic conditions or had chronic conditions. What did they identify as the problem? And so we got people together all over the country by webinars and in person. Started in Dallas. Everything starts in Dallas, right? And over a year or so, they came up with 3 things that really were the issues that they felt we needed to grapple if we were going to get better care for older adults with multiple conditions. And one of them is we're focused on diseases and not on patient outcomes. And if you've got multiple diseases, how do you decide? And in fact, I actually, believe it or not, did this in one of my studies. Would you rather not have a hip fracture or would you rather not have a stroke? Stupid question. So when you got multiple diseases, disease outcomes don't work. The second problem is that nobody was asking people what mattered most to them. And the more diseases you have and the more life you have, the more variable you are in what matters most to you. The third thing was nobody is in charge. Everybody does their own little piece of the elephant. The cardiologist does this, the endocrinologist does that, the social worker does that. We couldn't take on that last one, so we took on the first 2. Trying to focus on patient outcomes rather than disease outcomes and find out what mattered in the face of trade-offs and see that's kind of what led to patient priorities care.
And what's the nuts and bolts of patient priorities care? And I wonder if you could distinguish it from, just thinking in my mind, within geriatrics, for example, attempts to geriatricize primary care docs. Within palliative care, they talk about, primary palliative care and training primary care docs and expert communication and goals of care discussions. How does patient priorities care fit in with those movements?
Yeah, first of all, I really don't feel like it's a movement. Second of all, I hate the name Patient Priorities Care, but we couldn't come up with anything better. And just like everybody does in 2019, we had a branding firm, and that's what got voted on. So it was the least offensive. So we don't think it's a model. It's not a structure. It really is the content of decision making and communication between patients and their clinicians. It works in palliative care. It works in geriatric care. It works in specialty care. It works everywhere. It's just a way to make the decisions when you're faced with multiple different trade-offs and multiple things that you can do, and people vary in what matters. And in many ways, as a geriatrician, Alex, as you know, is I think a lot of this is really taking the black box out of what we do as geriatricians. How do we make decisions with people who have multiple things happening simultaneously? And we try to give words to it. We try to provide steps both for the patient part of the equation and for the clinician part of the equation. And I will tell you, we borrowed shamelessly from palliative care in terms of the communication part of it. But I think that's okay, because I think palliative care has borrowed shamelessly from geriatrics and getting started. So trying to even the playing field.
And what actually, if I had to visualize, or can you tell me a story of what actually is patient priorities care? Is it just the goals of care discussion? Tell me about what's important to you, what matters most.
It's really more than that. Because again, you could call it goals of care. I never know what goals of care is, because it's one of those terms that. If you have a little bubble, everybody says the same thing, but in their brain, there's 20 different things that flash up in their brain when they use that term. So we try to avoid that term for that reason. So it basically starts, okay, if you want to make a decision based on people's priorities, the first thing you need to know is what are those priorities? And you need to know them in a way that's systematic and reliable and actionable, that it can inform decision making. So the first step is identifying people's priorities, and those are really two parts to it. One is the outcomes they want from their health care. They don't want their blood pressure under control because they like the number 120 better than they like the number 210. They want their blood pressure under control because they don't want to have a stroke, so that they can continue to go bowling or babysit or whatever they do. So it's the outcomes they want from their health care.
And that sounds really important too. It sounds like you have to push it. Like the outcome isn't, I don't want to have a stroke. The outcome that's meaningful, I want a stroke because I want to continue bowling. I want to be mentally aware so I can participate with my family, do crossword puzzles, go shopping, be independent, all those other outcomes. Is that right? Like you actually have to drill down a little bit?
You do have to drill down, and that's exactly right, because otherwise they're going to say what comes out of the top of their head, and it's going to change from day to day. So you have to drill down. And that's the other reason, is because, well, maybe it's the stroke that is not the thing that's going to keep them from doing what they want most. So when you got a lot of things going on, you got to drill down so it's specific enough and reliable enough. Exactly right. And you do that by starting with their values, which are value-based. People tell us those are the core values that people have throughout their life. Their goals, the way they live those values may change, but the values stay constant, and that's where we start the drilling. So we have, it looks like it comes under 4 areas, and I didn't believe it. Aanand Naik, I know, has done your podcast in the past, and his group, along with Lillian Dindo at Baylor, were the ones that really took the lead on this, and I learned a tremendous amount from them. Most values come under 4 simple categories. It's functioning and autonomy. It's relationships and community. Number 2, it's managing your health. And number 3, it's sort of meaningful things in your life, productivity. And basically, if you start with those 4 areas, you give people examples, and we trained people to do this, to give people prompts to come up with 3 key values that they really think define their values. And I was quite skeptical, and we've now done it in several hundred people, and it works. Takes about, the whole process to get to the actionable goals and preferences takes about 20 minutes. It's really doable.
That's terrific. So who does this? In your study that we're going to discuss today, you had trained facilitators. Is that sort of the broader vision of having facilitators, or is it to train primary care clinicians to do this eventually, or what's the ideal vision of how this is disseminated?
The ideal vision is whoever the hell wants to do it and can do it and has the time to do it. That's the only way you're going to get anything through the tough clinical workflow we have. In our particular study, right, we had an advanced practice nurse and a care manager who worked for the primary care group where we did our pilot, who were trained to do this. Basically, anybody who has some interviewing skills, particularly motivational interviewing skills, and are willing to go through the training, are able to do it. Patients, interestingly enough, when we first talked to them about this, they said, well, doctors probably weren't the best people to do this. And rather than being offended by that, although I completely agreed with them, they said it was probably just because doctors were too busy to do it. I think they had other reasons as well, but that was part of the reasons. But in truth, anybody can do this. The medical assistants can do it, social worker, nurses, physicians can do it. We are also now developing a way, in fact, that's what I was working on when you called me a few minutes ago, making this self-directed so patients and caregivers can already do this. And I'll tell you, I'm shamelessly borrowing from the way Prepare for Their Care has set up their website. So I shout out to Rebecca Sidori on that.
And to our listeners, if you want to listen to more about Prepare for Your Care, Rebecca, we've had 2 podcasts with Rebecca, and we have Anand. We'll have another podcast with him. We'll link that to our show notes, so you can just go to the Jerry Powell website.
Terrific. I want to move into talking about this trial now, and I wonder if you. Oh, go ahead,
Alex. I mean, that's only half the equation. Can I just very briefly tell you the other half of the equation? Because this is sometimes what it's a little bit different than a lot of the other communication skills, which is sort of one directed. It's directed at patients either talking to the clinicians or clinicians talking to patients. We really feel we needed to get at both sides of the equation. So we also have a way to get people to identify what parts of their current care they think is working and doable, and what parts they think is just too hard for them and they really don't think is helpful, they'd like to get rid of. But we also have prepared clinicians to take this information and develop strategies, a few simple strategies for translating what is their current way they approach decision making, which is based on diseases, to translate that into decisions based on patients' priorities. So if we have time, I can tell you what those strategies are, but I just want to make sure it's really both of those is patient priorities care.
I think we should talk about that because that's such a critical step. I mean, so many clinicians have been told, you need to do goal-aligned treatment, and they're like, okay, they ask about some goals, and then they're like, I don't know what to do with that. I've not been trained. I went through medical school. We talked about how to treat diseases, not how to treat goals. So it'd be really interesting to hear, some examples of how these strategies play out.
Sure. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't have a clue either. That's why I had to get a lot more smart people around the table to help us figure this out. We always sort of talk about this project as sort of flying the plane as we're building it. We never know what the next step is going to be. So what we did, we got using the actual patients that are part of the trial, we'll talk about in a minute. We got the primary care clinicians and the cardiologists, because those were two groups we worked with. We got them on the phone with Daisy Smith, who is a general internist, the vice president of clinical activities and clinical training at American College of Physicians, and Lillian Dindo, who is a behavioral expert who works with Aanand Naik at Baylor. Got them on the phone as coaches to have us actually work through actual patients who are part of this, and through that we recorded these. They listened to them, and I will tell you, it was unbelievable. It was just organically. The whole group together was figuring out what they were going to do once they were faced with people's goals and preferences and knowing their health conditions. And from that, we came up with a few strategies. I'll tell you very briefly what those are. Is number one, and this is not rocket science. Number one, start with one thing. Start with the thing that patients care most about. If you got 1,000 things and you don't know a right answer, why not start with what matters most to them? This became what we call a specific ask, and I can tell you more about that. The second thing is serial trials. It's what we do anyways, right? If we don't know what the hell we're doing, let's try A, let's try B. But we turned that around from being a limitation to being a strength, particularly when we had to let people know there was a lot of uncertainty. So we're going to start with this because it's what matters most to you. But if this doesn't work, don't worry. Then we could go on to this and we can go on to that. Set it up right from the beginning of serial trials. Third is always use their own outcomes and preferences, their own priorities, rather than their diseases in decision-making and communication, both with the patients and other clinicians. This worked particularly well between the primary providers and the clinicians because they got them all on the same page, so they were thinking about the same thing. The final thing was, and this came right from the pain world, is don't try to get rid of all their symptoms. It's impossible much of the time when there's a lot of things going on. Focus on the activity that the symptom is keeping them from doing. Use that in your communication and use that in seeing if whatever is working is working.
That's wonderful. I love that last thing about not focusing on like the number on their pain scale, but what does that mean as far as their function? I'm also wondering if we can maybe just make a case out of it. Let's say I'm a 72-year-old with COPD, CHF, some moderate AS, AFib.
We'll give you mild cognitive impairment.
Some mild cognitive impairment. What matters to me is being with my family, my grandchildren, being able to garden still outside. And I really, I just hate checking my weights every day. They tell me to do that. I never do it. And I don't love coming to the doctor, but I really want more time to be with my grandchildren. Want to see how they do over the course of the next couple of years. What else do you want to know about me, Mary?
So you say it's important for you to be with your family, with your grandchildren. Yeah. Tell me what you do, Eric, that honors that value of you. Like what makes you feel like I've really been with my grandchildren? What are the activities that you want to do?
Yeah, so I go over there on the weekends. I help parents out. Like we play games together. Like those types of things are. It's nothing specific. It's just being with them and sharing their lives.
Okay, so being with them, getting to their place, and being with them, and let's talk about playing games with them, because that's what grandkids love to do. Yeah. I'm hoping someday to be able to do that. So we would talk about that, and we would get it to being specific enough. People with a lot more talent at this than I will get you to get very specific in the activities, how often you do it. Great. Then we'll talk about, okay, what's keeping you from doing that right now? What is the thing that's keeping you from doing that?
Okay. And let's say, I get a little bit short of breath. I love taking my grandkids to baseball games, but it's getting a little bit harder to drive around. And when I'm walking, I just can't walk as far, so I have to stop a lot. And they kind of, I worry that they don't want grandpa around as much because I'm slowing them down.
Okay. So then we would work either if there was something about your health, whether it's changing your inhalers or doing pulmonary rehabilitation, that would help you so that you could do that particular activity better and keep up with the grandkids. Or they would say, depending upon what your health trajectory is, and that isn't possible, to talk about other activities that you could share with the grandkids that they would still love to spend time with you, at least to adolescents, because then they never want to spend time with anybody. But up until that time, so it'd either be changing your health care to get rid of that impediment, or change the activity to match up with what you're able to do.
And Are these discussions being documented in the EHR? Because I imagine that this is really important stuff for future decision making, knowing how people currently make decisions. And does it link at all to advanced care planning?
Well, our field, let me answer that last question first. I think it links directly to advanced care planning. Caroline Blum, who my partner in crime, a geriatrician at NYU, who I'm sure many of you know very well, came up with the term current care planning. It's great to talk about what you want 5 years from now or even 5 minutes from now, but let's talk about what you want right now. If you start doing it now, then there will never be such a thing as advanced care planning, because you're going to get it into your head right from the very beginning that you always talk about what your goals are now and how you're going to live out those goals and how your healthcare is going to help you. So it definitely aligns with advanced care planning and complements it very well. In terms of how we document it, the bane of everybody's existence is electronic health records. The only thing worse than having to use the electronic health records is not having it to be able to track what's going on. So we came up again with the input from the clinicians who are part of our work and with the patients. What is the core? What is the absolutely necessary information to really align care with people's outcome goals, given the care they're willing and able to do, and what is not, what can we jettison? And it could never be more than one page. So we have a one-page template that includes a very crude definition of their current functioning and support, what their perception of their health trajectory, how they think things are going to go over the next couple of years, because clinicians told us that people having unrealistic idea of their trajectory made it difficult in decision making. Then they come up with, I mentioned those values. They articulate 2 or 3 values that matter most to them. And from that, they have up to 3 SMART goal specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, achievable goals. 3 parts of their healthcare they think are helpful and doable. 3 parts of their healthcare that they think are just too hard or not helpful. And then ends up with this thing, the specific ask that brings it all together.
Yeah.
And that is the one health symptom or problem they think is most getting in the way of doing the activity that they think is most important. And this is the particular health problem they think is causing it. They'd like you to address. One page in the EHR we worked with, we had to do a workaround because it wasn't we couldn't get it directly into their EHR. Eventually, the goal is it could be adapted to every EHR, and so it lives someplace in the EHR. Hopefully, it will replace that advanced care planning tab with current care planning tab.
So, you do a trial on this. You're looking at whether or not this patient priorities, I'm blanking on the name
Care.
again. Patient priorities care, PPC. Identifying health priorities like specific healthcare goals, healthcare preferences, and then aligning decision making to achieve those priorities. Was that better than usual care?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So we did this in a primary care practice, along with the cardiology group that worked with them in here in Connecticut. And this was a very large practice, and so there was an office that we trained with patient priority decision making, and an office that remained usual care.
And how long is the training again?
The training takes there's the training for the facilitators that takes about an hour or 2 to begin with, and then some feedback sessions afterwards. For the clinicians, it was a couple of hours of face-to-face, and then we did phone calls that were about 20 minutes for a few months afterwards. So we're still
pretty short training.
They all thought it was too much, of course. And there's only so many bagels that you can bring to them. But we are definitely trying to get this as succinct as possible. It doesn't get you proficient, but I think it gets you started to doing it.
And can you take this training online? Are the materials free? Could any clinician out there who's listening, for example, go to a website and be trained themselves?
Well, I didn't even feed you that question, but thank you for asking it. You can get it in one of 2 ways. We did this along with the online curriculum for both identifying the priorities and doing priorities line decision making for clinicians. You can get it through the American College of Physicians website. It's one of a product that is free of charge. You can get CME credit or MOC credit, whichever you desire. You can also go to our website, Patient Priorities Care, all one word.org, and you can access it through that as well.
Terrific. And we'll put the links for that in our the blog post associated with this podcast.
But wait, I still don't know. Did it work? Should I even do it?
Well, you keep interrupting me, so let me tell you. No, you told me you promised me you would be interrupting, and thank you for doing that. So the simple answer is yes, we think it worked. And obviously one study, all the limitations all of us nerdy researchers do to our work, but the bottom line is yes, it worked. People that got patient priorities care, they perceived greater decrease in their perception of the burden of their treatment compared to those who got usual care. And they had less what's called unwanted care. And because as when we started doing this, both clinicians and patients were worried, well, wait a second, this is just rationing. You're going to keep stuff from us. So we really wanted to make sure any care that didn't happen was perceived as unwanted. And I can tell you how we define that if you'd like. But that more medications were stopped in the people got patient priorities care, particularly cardiovascular medications. They got fewer self-management tasks piled on because, we're asking people to do more and more, weigh themselves, do this diet, do this exercise, check your feet 5 times a day, do da-da-da-da. So less of that. And also had to go to get fewer lab tests and diagnostic tests such as x-rays. Didn't see much change in whether or not they thought their care was more goal oriented, but I'm not sure they necessarily understood that concept.
Mm-hmm. This is tremendously exciting. That first primary outcome that you mentioned, feeling like their total, treatment burden, the treatment burden questionnaire score improved for those in the patient priorities care group compared to the usual care group. What are the components of that score? What is it? What does that mean? And what is it? What's it evaluating?
Yeah. So thank you for that. So this is was developed by Victor Montori's group. He is a endocrinologist who's been very interested in the burdens of care for a very long time with some of his UK colleagues. He's at Mayo. So it includes the kind of things that you think about that we ask people to do. It talks about whether their medications are giving them adverse effects or are costing too much or too hard to remember to take, or there's just too many of them. It's do they spend too much of their time going to health visits, including the transportation and the time involved with all their health visits? Are they being asked to do too many things in terms of those self-management tasks I mentioned, getting weighed, et cetera, et cetera? So it reflects the actual activities that we ask people to do to take care of their chronic conditions. And it asks them on a scale, I believe it's from 1 to 10, but I could be wrong, how burdensome they felt it. So it's not just what we asked them to do, is how much burden they felt it caused them.
That's terrific. And we should mention that Victor Montori and a colleague wrote a terrific invited commentary that is also in JAMA Internal Medicine.
All right, Mary, I got a question. So let's say, I'm going to take this out of the medical sphere for a second. Let's say I go to my dentist. She does patient. God, I keep on forgetting the name.
See, this is why I hate the name. It's not memorable. If you can come up with a better one, Eric.
Patient priorities care. She does patient priorities care. I say I hate flossing, and she says, "Oh, don't floss then. Like, knock yourself out." Like, is this what we're seeing here? Like, we're seeing less meds, less burdensome care, but maybe it's like those things that may give them, going back 10 years instead of measuring kind of what's important to people, like measuring like survival.
The flossing is not keeping you alive.
Yeah, the flossing's killing my teeth, man. May not be a priority now, but when I got no teeth.
So great. That's about 10 different concepts in there. So let me kind of disimpact it a little bit.
You're going to tell me to floss, just like my dentist.
No, I'm not going to tell you to floss. This is all about trade-offs, right? We all want to live to 100 and not have to do anything to get there. I always say my major goal is I really want to be able to run a marathon, but I don't want to exercise. And so it's all about the trade-off. And so that's why we ask them about the outcomes and the care that they're willing and able to do and not willing and able to do, because that's what sets up the dialogue between the clinicians and the patients, right? Well, I see here that it's a really priority for you to be able to keep your teeth as you age, Eric. And I also see that you don't want to floss. None of us like to floss. My question to you is which is more important to you, to keep your teeth or to not floss?
So it's almost like a little motivational interviewing. Like, it's trying to get me to say and think, oh yeah, this is something that's important to me. And this is something, instead of having like the hygienist repeat the same thing over to me, you need to floss.
Exactly. And it ties into what matters to them. What happened a lot was CPAP. I don't know if your listeners all understand it. Those horrible masks, if you have sleep apnea, people hate them. But if you just ask them, wear your CPAP because it's going to give you a high blood pressure if you don't, tie it into the activity they want. And it actually happened. One of the persons, he was too tired in the afternoon to go with walks to walk his dog. So he said, well, would you try the mask for a week to see if you're able to walk your dog? That's the kind of thing. So yeah, it's not saying, okay, you don't want to do this, don't do it. It's saying, is given this trade-off what matters most to you. But you also do find stuff that we're asking people to do that once you hear it's too difficult for them and it doesn't really help them do what they want, then you say, well, maybe you don't really need to do that.
Right.
So it works for clinicians and patients to kind of to think differently.
Right. And it's important to say, as you just noted, that this isn't all about taking people off of things, off of medication, stopping them, weighing themselves, checking their feet, etc. It's also about, it's at its core, it's aligning the treatments they receive with their priorities. And sometimes that means they do more, like go on the CPAP so you can meet your goal of walking your dog. And sometimes it means you do less. Well, that isn't helping you meet your priority, so maybe we will stop the checking of the feet, etc. It's just on average, your study shows that it resulted in fewer tests, fewer self-management tasks, and fewer medications.
Correct. Nicely said.
And I wonder, you said earlier, I heard you refer to this study as a pilot. Was that correct?
Right. This was our first venture. Again, we were sort of building out the components of it, building out the workflow of it as we were doing it. This was just kind of trying to figure it out and need to try it out in other places with other people.
Mm-hmm. So what's the next step here? Are you going to try a larger multi-site study? Are there lessons learned from this that you're going to tweak as you go forward?
Well, I'm going to do a GoFundMe page, and anybody who wants to contribute to it to help our dissemination efforts would be well appreciated. No, we're going about this in several different ways, Alex. The first thing that we are doing, and this was really wonderful. I like the idea of passive dissemination because I don't want to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Be perfectly honest with you. So what happened was when we started talking about it, people came to us and say, well, maybe we'd like to try it. And that was kind of fatal on their part because if they even showed any sort of interest, we just globbed right on to them. And so we were lucky enough, Crystal Sene Wiley is a general internist at University of North Carolina, primary care provider who works with the rural clinics affiliated with University of North Carolina. And she was interested in doing something patient priorities care. And after sort of talking with her back and forth, so we said, well, why don't you just try this? So she has gotten funded from the National Institute on Aging to do a replication of this in the rural clinics in North Carolina with a very much more diverse and socioeconomically challenged population than we were able to do. We've just started working on that, so I'm really, really excited about that. We've taken little pieces of doing this in little bites. The emergency medicine people are interested in the specific ask piece of it. What's the outcome you really want from this visit? What are your fears and hopes? And just to kind of focus the ED visit. Also working with some chronic pain people to see if it works for people with chronic pain to get them off of opioids. So we're kind of doing it in multiple different ways.
That's wonderful. That's terrific. And what I love about this is quality care that every person would want, right? The care that is aligned with your priorities. So it's the right thing to do. That said, it will not.
I knew there was a but coming there.
Right. That said, in order to really disseminate it, health systems, primary care practices, emergency practices, et cetera, will be most interested in it if it somehow aligns with decreasing costs, aligning with, value propositions, shifting, landscape of healthcare and health law and, bundled payments, et cetera. Is there, do you have some efforts going forward? I mean, at face value, you would think that with, fewer medications and lab tests, this is likely cost savings, but are there demonstrations to actually tabulate up the costs of the intervention and the potential savings?
Yeah, so I think your point there is extremely well taken. What needs to be done is pretty straightforward, and who's against it, right? When I did fall prevention, we used to wear these little badges with somebody falling down the stairs and that little X, like, don't do it. And like somebody said, well, who is for old people falling, right? So people this is the right thing to do, but how do you get them to do it? So there's a couple of things we're sort of doing in that that direction. We're waiting for funding from a foundation to work with the primary care people at Cleveland Clinic to actually do a cost effectiveness, a value-based study of the value of this work. And we'll hear about that soon. So that's one direction we're going in. But we also realize there's so many different incentives and disincentives to do anything. So we're trying to sort of build the business case, if you will, and it depends upon your payment model. If you're an integrated, capitated, or risk-sharing environment, then decreasing a little bit of utilization is gonna be good for you, because the cost of actually doing this is not very much. If you are in a fee-for-service world, then what's the incentives for doing this? And there's still incentives because if you've got an office that's filled with people who don't necessarily need to be seen there, you don't have openings for people who are are better insured than Medicare patients, simply put. And using some of the current CMS codes can help be a revenue generator. So we're doing all of those types of things. And I think we're trying to get this as simple as possible so that more health systems are willing to do it. And that's one of the things, you just have to develop new skills. And these are skills that none of us that are started doing this work have, and we're learning them as we go. Anybody on the call who has, are listening to this, has any interest in working with us, let me know.
And I can imagine also, this is my last question, I can imagine there's some disincentives to do this if a lot of quality measures around what percentage of your patients have you done something to, like what percent are taking beta blockers for X, or are blood pressures meeting goals, or on specific medications for heart failure. Like, I can imagine if we're aligning with patients' goals, what's important to them, their values, that you actually sometimes may do worse on some of those measures.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we are working and that gets raised by a lot of the people we've talked to about this. A couple of answers to that questions. Number one, chances are pretty darn good that this approach to decision making will improve those metrics, because right now there's a lot of non-adherence because we're asking people to do stuff they just can't do. If you really get it aligned with what they're willing to do, I think their blood pressure and a lot of these other things are actually going to be better. Yeah. That's my own, and we plan to look at that, haven't done that yet. Number two is we're working to get, as you know, a lot of this population is no longer in those metrics. After the age of 75, the blood pressure metrics are no longer there. The hemoglobin metrics are not. The problem is health systems don't want to have different set of metrics for different patient populations. That's the problem. And there's a lot of people working towards developing patient-focused metrics, and we're hoping that those will be coming down the pike soon and be an incentive for this. But yes, right now there is at least a perceived disincentives of disease metrics for this work, which I don't think is really accurate.
Well, Mary, I want to thank you for joining us today. I learned a ton. Can you repeat the website again?
I thought you were going to ask me to repeat the name of the work.
I think I have it down now. Patient Priorities Care, PPC. Who's down with PPC? Every last buddy.
I want people to forget the term and do the approach. So it's good that people don't remember. It's Patient Priorities Care, all one word, .org.
Great. PatientPrioritiesCare.org. Mary, thank you very much. Before we leave, Alex, can you give us a little bit more?
A little bit more Ladies of the Canyon. And he sits you down to eat. She always makes you welcome in. Cats and babies round her feet, and all are fat and none are thin. None are thin and all are fat, and she may bake some brownies today. I hope so. Saying you are welcome back. She is another Canyon lady. Do 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 do.
And with that, Mary, a very big thank you for joining us on this
Thank you,
Jerry
Mary.
Pal podcast. To all our listeners for joining us as well. And with that, we thank you. Take a moment, if you haven't already, to we really love word of mouth. So if you can spread the good news about the Jerry Pal podcast amongst your colleagues on social media or review us on your favorite podcasting app today, that would be absolutely wonderful.
See you next week. Thank you.